Welcome to Life Stories, where we share the most heartfelt and inspiring tales of resilience, love, and life's toughest lessons. In today's story, we explore the incredible journey of a young woman who uncovers a shocking betrayal just days before her father's wedding. Faced with the ultimate challenge, she must find the courage to stand up for the truth and protect the man she loves most. Will her bravery be enough to stop disaster and heal their bond? Stay tuned to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join us for today's unforgettable story. When I look back on it now, the pieces were always there, scattered like breadcrumbs waiting to be noticed. But in those days, everything seemed so normal, or at least, as normal as life could be when your father was planning to remarry. I wanted to be happy for him, I really did. After everything we'd been through, after losing Mom, he deserved to be happy, he deserved to love again. But something about Rachel never sat right with me. It all began on a quiet afternoon in the house we shared in Chicago. The air was thick with the faint hum of wedding preparations, the muffled buzz of Rachel on the phone upstairs, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen as I tried to busy myself. Rachel had been in our lives for about a year by then. She'd swept in with her polished charm, her perfect smile, and her effortless grace. And somehow, in what felt like the blink of an eye, she had taken over. She was everywhere, hovering over the florist's decisions, adjusting seating charts, and smiling at my dad in that way that made him light up like a schoolboy. But behind her smile, there was something I couldn't quite name. Something sharp. Something cold. It wasn't obvious, no. Rachel was far too careful for that. But every now and then, I'd catch her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Her expression would shift, just for a fraction of a second. It wasn't anger or hatred. Not exactly. It was more like calculation. Like she was sizing me up, determining how much of a threat I might be to whatever it was she was planning. That day, the feeling was stronger than ever. Maybe it was the way Rachel's voice carried through the hallway, that sharp edge to her normally sugary tone. Or maybe it was just my gut, twisting in ways I couldn't ignore. Whatever it was, I found myself walking upstairs, my feet moving almost of their own accord, toward the slightly ajar door of Dad's study. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Truly, I didn't. But the moment I heard her say my dad's name, I froze. "Jack doesn't suspect a thing," Rachel said, her voice low and clipped. It was such a stark contrast to the warm, sweet tone she usually used around my father that I barely recognized it. My heart began to pound as I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more. "Yes. Everything's in place," she continued. "Once the wedding is over, he'll sign everything. The accounts. The assets. It'll all be mine. He's like a puppy dog, following my every word." I felt my stomach churn, the blood draining from my face. What was she talking about? My dad's finances? His assets? Why would she even need access to them? Then she laughed, a cold, cruel laugh that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, don't worry. By the time he realizes anything's wrong, it'll already be too late. And if he becomes a problem, well, there are always other options." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Other options? What did that even mean? My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her conversation. Was she planning to leave him after the wedding? Or worse, was she planning to harm him? The room seemed to spin around me as I realized the depth of her deception. This wasn't just about money. This was about my father's safety, his very life. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back down the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. My father needed to know. He needed to see Rachel for who she truly was. But how? How could I tell him without proof? He loved her, trusted her. He would never believe me, not without something concrete to back me up. That was when I decided to search her things. I knew it was wrong. Knew it was an invasion of her privacy. But I didn't care. If Rachel was planning to hurt my dad, I had to find out. The study was quiet when I entered it later that afternoon, my hands trembling as I began opening drawers and rifling through papers. At first, there was nothing, just wedding contracts, guest lists, and other mundane details. But then, beneath a stack of seemingly harmless documents, I found them, a set of legal papers that made my stomach drop. Power of attorney, financial control, life insurance policies that had been altered recently. It was all there, spelled out in cold, clinical terms that left no room for doubt. Once they were married, Rachel would have complete control over my dad's assets. And if something happened to him, an accident, an illness, she stood to gain everything. My hands shook as I shoved the papers back into the drawer, my mind reeling. I wanted to march downstairs and confront her right then and there. But I knew it wasn't the right time. I needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to tell my dad in a way that he would believe me. Rachel was clever, far more clever than I had given her credit for, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not when so much was at stake. For the next few days, I carried the weight of what I had discovered like a stone in my chest. Every time I saw Rachel laughing with my dad, charming their friends, fluttering around the house in her perfect, polished way, I felt my anger bubble just beneath the surface. How could she pretend so easily? How could she look my dad in the eyes and lie to him so convincingly? But more than anything, I felt helpless. My dad was so happy, so in love, and I didn't know how to break through the wall Rachel had built around him. Every time I tried to imagine telling him the truth, I saw his face falling, his trust in me shattering. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was just jealous? Just a scared little girl who couldn't handle her father moving on? By the time the wedding day arrived, I was a mess of nerves. The ceremony was set to take place in Los Angeles, and the house was alive with last-minute preparations. Guests were arriving, flowers were being arranged, and Rachel was everywhere, gliding through the chaos like a queen overseeing her kingdom. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to tell my dad. It didn't matter if he believed me or not, I couldn't stay silent. As the clock ticked closer to the ceremony, I found myself standing outside his room, my hands trembling as I knocked on the door. "Come in," his voice called, warm and familiar. And for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. He sounded so happy, so at peace. Was I really about to destroy that? I stepped inside, finding him sitting on the edge of the bed, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked up and smiled at me, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that way that always made him seem younger. "Nervous for the big day?" he teased, his tone light. I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. I had to tell him. "Dad, we need to talk." His smile faltered, concern clouding his face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle. Before I could answer, the door creaked open behind me, and there she was, Rachel, dressed in a silk robe, her hair pinned back in elegant curls, her presence filling the room like a shadow. "Jack," she said sweetly, her voice as smooth as honey, "we need to finalize the seating chart. The caterer is waiting." I froze, my words dying in my throat. Rachel's eyes flickered toward me, her expression unreadable. But I felt it, that coldness, that control. She knew. Somehow. She always knew. My dad looked between us, his brow furrowed. "Can this wait until after the ceremony?" he asked me, his voice soft but firm. "Let's not stress before the big moment." I opened my mouth to protest, but Rachel was already steering him toward the door, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Jack. Sweetheart. The caterer is waiting," she said again, her tone leaving no room for argument. And just like that, they were gone, leaving me standing alone in the room, my heart sinking like a stone. How could I stop the wedding when Rachel was always 2 steps ahead? How could I protect my dad when he refused to see the truth? I didn't have the answers yet. But I knew one thing: I wasn't giving up. Not yet. As the hours ticked by, the house buzzed with an air of celebration. But for me, it felt like the walls were closing in. The sound of laughter echoed through the hallways. The chatter of guests arriving to witness what they believed would be a perfect union. The sun was beginning to set over Los Angeles, casting a golden glow across the carefully arranged ceremony space, with flowers draped over every surface and candles waiting to be lit. To everyone else, it looked like the start of something beautiful. But to me, it felt like a slow march toward disaster. Rachel moved through it all like she owned the place, dressed in her wedding gown now, gliding from one guest to the next, her laughter tinkling like wind chimes. She was breathtaking. There was no denying that. The guests couldn't stop talking about her beauty, how radiant she looked, how lucky my dad was. But all I could see was the woman who had woven herself into our lives like a spider spinning its web. The woman I knew was about to destroy everything if I didn't stop her. I hovered at the edges of the crowd, my heart racing, my mind swirling with doubt and fear. I knew what I had to do, but the weight of it threatened to crush me. Every time I looked at my dad, standing near the altar laughing with one of his friends, his face lit with happiness, my resolve wavered. What if I was wrong? What if I ruined this day for him, only to find out I had misunderstood everything? Could I live with myself if I shattered his happiness for nothing? But then I saw her again. Rachel. Her veil was pushed back for the moment, and her face was the picture of serene joy as she smiled and charmed everyone around her. But when our eyes met, that coldness was back. It was just a flicker, a tiny crack in her perfect mask. But it was enough. I felt it like a punch to the stomach. The reminder of the conversation I had overheard, the legal papers I had found. I wasn't wrong. I couldn't be wrong. My chest tightened as I realized the ceremony was about to begin. The officiant stepped up to the altar, signaling for everyone to take their seats. And the music swelled, soft and melodic, filling the air with anticipation. The bridesmaids and groomsmen began walking down the aisle, smiling, their faces glowing with the joy of the moment. Each step they took felt like a clock ticking down to the moment when it would be too late. I wanted to move, to stand up, to stop it all before it went any further. But my body refused to cooperate. Fear held me in place like chains, and my mind raced with 1,000 what ifs. What if no one believed me? What if they thought I was just being petty or jealous? What if my dad hated me for ruining the happiest day of his life? The music shifted, and the guests turned toward the aisle as Rachel appeared. A vision in white, her veil now covering her face. The collective gasp from the crowd felt like a knife to my chest. Everyone was so enchanted, so blinded by the illusion she had created. Everyone but me, as she glided toward the altar, her arm hooked in the crook of her father's. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with mine through the veil. And in that moment, I knew. She wasn't just confident, she was daring me to act, challenging me to do something, to make a scene. It was as if she already knew I wouldn't. I swallowed hard, the pressure inside me building like a dam about to break. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about my dad. About protecting him. About stopping this before it was too late. I couldn't let my fear paralyze me. If I stayed silent, I would never forgive myself. The music faded as Rachel reached the altar, taking her place beside my dad, her smile radiant beneath the veil. The officiant began to speak, his voice warm and steady, welcoming everyone and speaking of love and commitment. But I barely heard a word of it. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then it happened. The officiant turned to Rachel and my dad, asking them to exchange their vows. The moment Rachel opened her mouth to speak, I felt something snap inside me. I can't let this happen, I said. my voice breaking the heavy silence of the room. Every head turned toward me. Confusion and shock etched on their faces. My dad's brow furrowed as he stared at me. His voice uncertain. "Emma, what's going on?" My legs felt like jelly as I stood. My hands trembling. But I forced myself to hold his gaze. "Dad, I need to talk to you. Right now." Rachel's smile faltered. Just for a moment. But she quickly recovered. Her voice soothing as she turned to me. "Emma. Sweetheart. Maybe you're just feeling overwhelmed. Weddings can do that sometimes." "No," I said, cutting her off. My voice stronger now. "I'm not overwhelmed. I know exactly what I'm saying." The room was silent. Every guest holding their breath. Waiting for what would come next. I could feel their judgment. Their disbelief. But I didn't care. This wasn't about them. It wasn't even about me. It was about my dad and the truth he needed to hear. I took a step forward. My voice trembling but determined. "Dad, I should have told you this sooner. But I was scared you wouldn't believe me. Rachel isn't who she says she is. She's lying to you." The murmurs began. Soft and uncertain. As the crowd exchanged nervous glances. My dad's expression shifted. Confusion giving way to concern. "Emma, what are you talking about?" I took a deep breath. My heart pounding. I overheard her. "Dad. She's been planning this all along. She doesn't love you, she's trying to take everything from you. Your money. Your business, your life." Rachel's voice was like velvet as she spoke. Her tone laced with sadness. "Jack. She's upset. She doesn't want to see you move on. That's all this is." But I wasn't going to let her take control of the situation. Not this time. I stepped closer to my dad. My voice firm. "It's not just words. Dad. I found papers in her study, legal documents giving her control over everything once you're married. I'm not making this up. She's been lying to you from the start." The room fell deathly silent as my dad stared at me. His face pale. His eyes searching mine for answers. Rachel's mask of calm began to slip. Just slightly. And I knew the battle had only just begun. For a moment. It felt as though time had stopped. The weight of the room pressed down on me as every pair of eyes fixed on my dad. Rachel. And me. My dad stood frozen. His brow furrowed. His lips slightly parted as though he was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. I could feel his confusion. His disbelief. But more than that. I could feel the tension radiating off Rachel. She was no longer the poised, perfect bride everyone thought she was. There was something colder about her now. Something sharp beneath the polished surface. "Emma." Dad began. His voice strained. His tone caught somewhere between disbelief and frustration. This is a lot to process. You're accusing Rachel of something serious. Are you sure about this?" I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. But I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Yes. Dad. I wouldn't say this if I wasn't sure. I've seen the documents. I heard her talking about you. About taking control of everything after the wedding. Please. You have to believe me." Rachel's soft, velvety laugh cut through the silence, drawing the attention of the room. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from genuine amusement. No, it was calculated. Meant to soothe. To disarm. "Jack," she said. Her voice as sweet as honey. "This is all just a misunderstanding. Emma has been through a lot, losing her mom. Adjusting to our relationship, and it's understandable that she might feel a little protective of you. But to say these things, it's not true. I would never hurt you." Her words were like poison, twisting the truth so effortlessly it almost made me doubt myself. Almost. But I could see it now, the way her hands gripped the bouquet just a little too tightly. The way her eyes darted to the guests, scanning for their reactions. She wasn't calm. She was cornered. And she knew it. "Protective?" I repeated. My voice louder than I intended. "This isn't about being protective. This is about the truth. I found legal papers. Rachel. Documents giving you power over everything my dad owns. Why would you need that? Why would you even have those? Rachel's smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. Emma. Sweetheart, she said. Her tone soft but laced with condescension. You're misunderstanding what you saw. Those papers were about financial security, things your father and I were discussing as part of our future together. It's not unusual for couples to have plans in place like that. You're making it sound so much worse than it really is. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. No. Rachel. You're twisting this around. You weren't discussing anything with him, you were planning this behind his back. I heard you. I heard you on the phone, talking about taking everything from him. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as guests exchanged glances. Some skeptical, some concerned. For the first time, I saw cracks beginning to form in Rachel's facade. She wasn't winning them over as easily as she thought she would. Jack, she said, turning to my dad, her voice trembling just slightly now. You know me. You know how much I love you. This, she gestured toward me, as though I were some misguided child throwing a tantrum. This is just nerves. Weddings can be overwhelming. Especially for kids. She doesn't mean it. I do mean it. I snapped, cutting her off. I mean every word. And if you love him so much, then why were you talking about other options if he became a problem? What did you mean by that? Rachel? Her head snapped toward me, and for the briefest moment, the mask slipped. I saw it, the flash of anger, of frustration, the cold calculation she had been hiding. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by her perfect, poised expression. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said smoothly. You must have misheard something. I would never say anything like that. But I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when I was finally getting through. You can lie all you want, Rachel. But I know what I heard. And I'm not the only one who's noticed something isn't right. From the corner of the room, a voice broke through the murmurs. Actually, said Mrs. Harper, one of my dad's longtime friends. Her tone cautious. I did see Rachel talking to someone outside earlier. It looked tense. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now. Rachel's head whipped around to face her, the polite smile slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of the fury beneath. With all due respect, Rachel said, her voice clipped but still trying to sound calm. You must be mistaken. I was outside finalizing some last-minute details. Nothing unusual. But it was too late. The murmurs had grown louder, the doubt spreading through the crowd like wildfire. I could see it in their faces now. The way they were beginning to look at her, not with admiration, but with suspicion. And then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke up. You know, said Mr. Sanders, another family friend. I thought I saw Rachel at the courthouse last week. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, I don't know. Rachel's composure faltered visibly now, her lips tightening, her eyes darting to my dad as if willing him to stop this before it got worse. Jack, she said, her voice sharper now. You're not seriously going to listen to this, are you? These are just misunderstandings, gossip. You know me. You know who I am. My dad's expression was unreadable as he turned to her. His brow furrowed, his eyes searching hers. Do I? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Because right now, I'm not so sure. For the first time, Rachel looked genuinely shaken. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for him, her voice breaking. Jack, please, don't let them do this. Don't let them ruin what we have. But my dad didn't move. And in that moment, I knew he was beginning to see the truth. I knew Rachel's grip on him, on all of us, was slipping. The cracks in her perfect image were growing. And I wasn't about to let her rebuild them. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like I could reach out and touch it. Rachel's composure was crumbling before our eyes. Her voice, once calm and collected, had grown sharper, more desperate. As the murmurs from the guests grew louder, she kept glancing at my dad, pleading silently, but his face remained unreadable. His trust in her was cracking. Just as it should have been. "Jack," she said again, her voice trembling now. "Please. Don't let them do this to us. This is just a misunderstanding. A mistake. You know me. You know how much I love you." But something had shifted. My dad's eyes, once so warm and trusting whenever he looked at Rachel, now held a cold uncertainty. He glanced around the room, taking in the whispers, the concerned looks of family and friends, the pieces of the puzzle that were beginning to come together. "Rachel," he said, his voice low but steady, "if there's nothing to hide, why are there so many questions? Why does Emma feel so strongly about this? Why are people mentioning seeing you at the courthouse? And what are these documents she's talking about?" Rachel opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. For the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. She was losing control of the situation. And she knew it. It was at that moment that the sound of police sirens cut through the air outside the venue. The murmurs in the room fell to a hush as the unmistakable sound grew louder. Closer. Someone must have called them, I thought. A small flicker of relief washing over me. Maybe one of the guests had seen how out of control things were becoming and decided to act. Maybe they had sensed, just as I had, that there was something far more sinister at play here. When the two police officers entered the room, their presence sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. They were calm and professional, but the sheer authority they carried with them silenced the last of the whispers. The taller of the two, a man with a stern but not unkind face, stepped forward, scanning the room. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked. His voice measured. My dad glanced at me, his confusion and hesitation clear. He wasn't sure how to explain. Wasn't even sure what was going on anymore. So, I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, but my voice steady. "There's been a serious situation," I began, forcing myself to meet the officer's eyes. "My dad was about to marry this woman, Rachel." I gestured toward her. "But she's been lying to him. She's been planning to take his money, control his assets. And, worse, I overheard her talking about it. And I found documents that back up what I'm saying." The officer's expression remained neutral as he turned to Rachel. He said, "Do you have anything to say about these allegations?" Rachel, to her credit, didn't lose her cool right away. She straightened her shoulders, her voice calm once more. "This is ridiculous," she said, her tone dripping with indignation. "This is just a scared little girl trying to sabotage her father's happiness because she doesn't want him to move on. There's no truth to any of it." I clenched my fists, anger rising in me again. "That's not true," I said firmly. "I heard you, Rachel. I heard you talking about taking everything from him. And I found the papers in your study. You can deny it all you want. But I know the truth." The female officer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Given the seriousness of these accusations," she said, her tone cool and professional, "we're going to need to look into this. We'll need to search your belongings. If there's nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem." Rachel's composure wavered for the briefest moment. Her eyes flickered to her handbag, which was resting on a nearby chair. "You can't just go through my things," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I have a right to privacy." The male officer gave her a long, hard look. "If you've done nothing wrong, there's nothing to worry about." The room was silent as everyone watched the exchange, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Rachel hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw her fear. She knew what they would find. She knew the game was up. Finally, with a reluctant nod, she stepped aside, allowing the female officer to approach her bag. The officer picked it up, carefully opening it and beginning to search through its contents. The room held its breath, every eye fixed on the small handbag and the officer's deliberate movements. And then she paused. Her hand dipped into one of the side pockets. Pulling out a folded piece of paper, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the document quickly before turning to her partner. "You're going to want to see this," she said, her tone serious. The male officer took the paper from her. Reading it over, his expression darkened, and he turned back to Rachel, holding the document up for everyone to see. "Care to explain this?" he asked. It was one of the papers I had found in Rachel's study, detailing her plans to gain control over my dad's finances once they were married. The room erupted into gasps and murmurs as the truth finally began to sink in. My dad's face went pale as he stared at the document, his hands trembling slightly. "Rachel," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. What is this? What were you planning?" Rachel's mask finally shattered. Her face twisted into something unrecognizable, cold, hard, and full of fury. "You think I cared about you," she spat, her voice venomous. "You were just a means to an end, Jack. A way to get what I deserved. And you, Emma," she turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You'll regret this. I promise you'll regret this." The officers didn't give her a chance to say more. The male officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Rachel, you're under arrest," he said firmly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they escorted her out of the room, Rachel's voice echoed behind her, shrill and full of rage. "This isn't over. Emma, you'll pay for this." But as the doors closed behind her, the weight on my chest finally lifted. She was gone. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. The room was silent in the aftermath of Rachel's arrest. The guests, once cheerful and full of anticipation, now sat stunned, their whispers reduced to faint murmurs. It was a different kind of silence than before, heavier, somber, like the air itself was weighed down by what had just unfolded. My dad hadn't moved. He stood frozen at the altar, the document still in his hands, his face pale and his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying the weight of the world. I didn't know what to say to him. My chest still ached from the confrontation, the adrenaline slowly fading and leaving a hollow, shaky feeling in its place. All I wanted to do was run to him, to tell him it was okay, that I had done this to protect him. But he looked so broken, so lost. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if he would even want to hear me. "Dad," I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the paper in his hands, his fingers trembling as he read and reread the words. I took a step closer, and that was when he finally looked up. His eyes met mine, and the pain in them was almost too much to bear. "I don't," he started, but his voice faltered. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know what to say. I can't believe this. I can't believe I didn't see it." "Dad," I said again, more firmly this time, and I stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. "This isn't your fault." He let out a shaky breath, his eyes filling with tears. "How can it not be? Emma, she fooled me. She fooled all of us. I almost married her. I almost let her take everything, and I didn't see it. Not until not until," his voice cracked. And he trailed off, his head bowing as he stared at the floor. I swallowed hard, trying to hold back my own tears. Seeing him like this, so hurt, so vulnerable, was almost worse than anything Rachel had done. "You couldn't have known," I said gently, my hand still resting on his arm. "She was careful, Dad. She was manipulative. She did everything she could to make sure you wouldn't suspect anything. That's not on you. That's on her." He shook his head again, his jaw tightening. "I should have listened to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I thought you were just scared, that you didn't want me to move on. But you were right. You saw what I couldn't. And I didn't believe you. I'm so sorry." Emma. The guilt in his voice cut through me like a knife. I shook my head quickly, blinking back tears. Don't apologize. Dad. Please. You were in love. You wanted to be happy. There's nothing wrong with that. And you didn't ignore me. Not completely. You're listening now. And that's what matters. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. You saved me, he said. His voice breaking. You stood up when no one else would. You didn't let her get away with it. Emma. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to speak up. My breath hitched. And I felt my own tears spill over. I had spent so long feeling like I was fighting this battle alone. Like no one would ever believe me. Hearing my dad say those words, that he saw me, that he understood, made it all worth it. Every sleepless night. Every moment of doubt. Every second of fear. It had all been worth it to protect him. I couldn't let her hurt you, I said. My voice trembling. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. You're my dad. And I love you. That's all there is to it. His expression softened. And before I knew it, he pulled me into his arms. Holding me tightly, I clung to him. The tears coming harder now as the weight of everything finally hit me. We stayed like that for a long moment, holding on to each other, as if letting go might shatter the fragile peace we had found. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a small, tired smile on his face. You're stronger than I ever realized, he said quietly. I don't think I've told you that enough. But I see it now. You're incredible, Emma. And I am so proud of you. The warmth in his voice filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel like I was fighting against the world on my own. We were in this together now. My dad and I, and nothing could break that bond. The rest of the guests began to trickle out after that. Most of them offering hushed words of comfort to my dad or quiet apologies for doubting me. It didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. And Rachel was gone. For now. That was enough. As the last of the guests left and the venue grew quiet, my dad and I sat together in one of the empty rows, the fading sunlight casting a warm glow over the room. We didn't say much, there wasn't much left to say, but we didn't need to. Just being there, side by side, was enough. After a while, my dad let out a soft sigh, his gaze distant. I don't know what's going to happen next, he said. But I do know one thing. I'll never doubt you again. Emma. I'll always trust you. I smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. And I'll always have your back, Dad. No matter what. The weight of the day still hung over us. But in that moment, sitting together in the quiet of the empty hall, I felt something new. Hope. Hope that we could rebuild. Hope that we could move forward. Together. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself believe that everything was going to be okay. The days that followed Rachel's arrest were quiet. But they carried a strange heaviness. The house felt empty without her. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that came with peace, but the kind that lingered after a storm. Every room seemed too big. Too quiet. As though we were trying to adjust to the absence of something or someone that had loomed far too large for far too long. My dad and I moved around each other carefully, both of us trying to process what had happened in our own ways. For him, it was guilt. I could see it in the way he avoided looking at Rachel's things. The way his shoulders sagged when he thought I wasn't watching. He spent hours sitting in the living room, staring out the window as though trying to piece together how he had let someone like Rachel into his life. He didn't say much. But he didn't need to. The pain in his eyes said it all. For me, it was relief. But also something more complicated. The weight of carrying the truth had been lifted. But I couldn't shake the memories, the sound of Rachel's voice on the phone. The look in her eyes when she realized she'd been exposed. The venom in her words as she was led away in handcuffs. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Something that might have spared my dad from the pain he was now feeling. But even through the silence and the grief, something else began to grow between us. A bond. It wasn't new. Exactly. But it was deeper now. Forged in the fire of everything we had been through. We didn't talk about it much at first. We didn't need to. It was there in the way my dad started asking for my opinion on things. The way he trusted me without hesitation. And it was there in the way I found myself watching over him. Making sure he was okay. Making sure he knew he wasn't alone. One morning, about 3 days after the wedding that wasn't he, I came downstairs to find him in the kitchen. He was making coffee. The smell filling the air like a quiet reminder that life was still moving forward. He looked up when he saw me, offering a weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning," he said softly. "I made you some toast. Not sure if it's any good, though." I smiled back, touched by the gesture. It wasn't much, but it was something. We sat together at the small kitchen table. The silence between us comfortable but heavy. I waited, sensing that he had something to say but wasn't quite ready to say it yet. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he said. His voice low. His words careful. "About everything. About Rachel. About you." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I keep going over it in my head," he said, running a hand through his hair. "All the little things I missed. The signs. The moments where I should have seen it. Should have known something wasn't right. But I didn't. I let her fool me. Emma. And because of that, I almost lost everything." I reached out, placing my hand over his. "You didn't lose everything, Dad," I said gently. "You're still here. I'm still here. And we're going to be okay." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with so much emotion that it took my breath away. "You saved me," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how I didn't see it. But you did. You saw through her when I couldn't. And you stood up to her. Even when no one else believed you. Emma. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes. But I blinked them away, trying to stay strong for him. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "You're my dad. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I should have listened to you sooner," he said. "I should have trusted you. I'm so sorry." "Emma. Don't," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Don't apologize. You wanted to believe the best in her. That doesn't make you weak, Dad. It makes you kind. It makes you human." He smiled at that. A small, genuine smile that made my chest ache with a bittersweet kind of warmth. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said. "You're stronger than I'll ever be. You know that." I laughed softly, brushing a stray tear from my cheek. "We're strong in different ways," I said. "You've been through so much, Dad. And you're still here. That's strength too." Over the next few days, we began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. And it wasn't fast. There were moments when I could see the hurt in my dad's eyes. Moments when the weight of everything he had almost lost seemed to crush him. But there were also moments of hope, small, fleeting. But there nonetheless. Like the time we sat together in the living room, talking about everything and nothing. And he laughed for the first time in days. Or the time he asked me to help him go through the remaining wedding plans, carefully dismantling the life he had almost built with Rachel. Piece by piece. "I'm not rushing into anything ever again," he told me one evening as we packed away decorations that had never been used. "From now on, I'm taking things slow. And I'm going to make sure I listen to you. Emma. You see things I don't. I can't ignore that anymore." I nodded, my chest swelling with a quiet pride. "We'll figure it out together," I said. "Whatever comes next, we'll handle it. Just the two of us." He smiled at that. A soft, tired smile that spoke of healing. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. Not right away. And not without effort. But eventually. We would be okay. Because no matter what Rachel had tried to do, no matter how close she had come to tearing us apart, she hadn't succeeded. Our bond was stronger than her lies, stronger than her manipulation. And as we sat there, side by side, the quiet settling over us like a blanket, I realized something. Rachel's betrayal had tested us in ways we had never been tested before, but it had also reminded us of what really mattered: love, trust, family. In the end, we hadn't just survived the storm, we had grown stronger because of it. And that, I thought, was the most important lesson of all. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to feel normal again. My dad and I grew closer than ever, bound by the lessons we had learned together. Rachel's betrayal had left its mark, but it also taught us the importance of trust, vigilance, and the strength of family. My dad began to heal, his once broken heart mending piece by piece, and I found a new sense of confidence in myself, knowing that standing up for the truth, no matter how hard it is always worth it. We laughed again, shared quiet evenings on the porch, and talked about our hopes for the future. Rachel was no longer a shadow in our lives, she was just a memory, a reminder of what we overcame together. And while the scars of the experience would always remain, they also served as proof of our resilience. As the sun set on another day, my dad turned to me with a soft smile. "Thank you, Emma," he said, "for everything." I smiled back, knowing that we had come through the storm stronger than ever. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more heartfelt tales from life stories. See you in the next video.